Well, hello there. Let's jump into it. We're doing research based on 200-year-old newspapers. We're currently covering the 1810s. Britain has just helped South America gain its independence. Not for the sake of nothing, though. She has opened their markets for their goods to be flown to the British Isles via newly set up trade routes. Never before seen creatures, alpacas are among those goods. Their incredible wool seems to have given birth to hopes for insane profits in the British wool sector. The trade is, however, only starting to take shape, and rather surprisingly, other alternative alpaca uses seem to be taking shape faster. Well, despite the hopes for wool, the first British alpacas were entirely there for the sake of this aspect of them. Or they were, but there were so little of them that they couldn't really fulfill any kind of wool production needs, so they were used for other purposes. Those being to profit off of how incredibly interesting and, most importantly, cute, huggable and adorable they were. So the initial purpose then was what could be called a curiosity, an object of fascination. So yeah, unironically, the wool was of course noticed first, but the strange, fluffy creature was also pretty darn interesting to look at. One of the first, if not the first, alpaca arrived to Britain in the 1810s. It arrived from Peru for the price of 2 horses to England's Liverpool. This individual had been a Peruvian lady's pet, and in England it would become yet another lady's pet, that being a wealthy noblewoman just nicknamed Miss Liverpool. Apparently she fell in love with what she called the mountain stranger, and it seems to have received a rather good loving home in the land an ocean away. Miss Liverpool would not, however, keep her mountain stranger for long. For a man named Mr. Edward Cross from the Surrey Zoological Garden would come to know of this creature of immense wealth she had. So he offered to and bought it for the price of £100, or what would be 10,000 euros in today's money. Man, inflation really has run rampant, hasn't it? Edward Cross was, I suppose, a mediocre zoo proprietor and a showman. He collected all kinds of exotic animals and kept them in awfully cramped little cages for people to come look at in exchange for money. The guy had everything from orangutans to giraffes and hyenas to elephants. For example, the elephant there. That one was abused for years until it snapped, killed a zookeeper and got euthanized by a firing squad. Not a fun story. Crazy stuff, but I don't think we are here for the elephants today. We are here for the alpacas, so how did that one go? Well, the press does not tell us how the alpacas were kept in general, but what we do know is that the Cross would present and showcase his now 2 female alpacas, a brown and a white one, in London's Piccadilly Circus for a period of 6 years from 1810 to 1816. So really at the center of world commerce there. Well, this strategy seems to have been profitable, for every time the alpacas were brought there, they'd receive a massive audience which offered them everything from biscuits to cakes. Luckily, this was not the alpacas' main source of food though, for they were mostly fed a mostly proper diet of hay, beans, carrots and oats. Most strangely for the people at the time, however, the alpacas never seemed to wish to drink anything. Even a teacup of water apparently did not go down. Now, you might be thinking, oh yeah, that's a camelid species. Makes sense. But alpacas do drink their fair share of fresh water. That is, when they are at peace and quiet. Not in the middle of freaking Piccadilly Circus. Anyway. So, those 2 seem to have been Britain's first ever alpacas. Interestingly, the 3rd alpaca seems to have also been a show alpaca. This was a 1.1 meter tall white and brown female that would do tricks to a large audience in the world's famous Ducrow Circus. she was thought to jump, kneel down, and lay down on command, and would often perform alongside an ultra-famous clown from the circus, no other than Joseph Grimaldi. He was literally the most famous entertainer of his era. In that picture, yeah, indeed, that's Grimaldi performing with the alpaca. But it gets even better. In 1813, this alpaca would even perform in a prestigious theatre performance in London's Covent Garden Theatre. Man, this alpaca, she really got the spotlight of the entertainment business. A real wool-coated celebrity. Well, outside of these massively popular shows and spectacles, our star was kept rather depressingly in a fencing at the circus's backyard. Excluding the times, of course, when the circus was on the road. As a daily exchange for her services, the alpaca would receive a pretty interesting diet. Not something any modern alpaca owner would recommend, but I suppose it kept the alpaca alive well enough. It consisted of pieces of bread, hay, carrots, sweets, and the occasional mashed potatoes. From that list, yeah, I suppose hay is alright, but everything else is like, nah, man, what are you doing? The alpaca is going to choke, get obese, and have major digestive issues. And besides that, there's the whole alpaca mental health, or more specifically, social aspect. Alpacas prefer themselves a herd of at least 3 individuals. So yeah, with this case we only got 1. Not even 2 like with Cross's showcases. We got a solo actor from a world and ocean away that was refused any interaction with her own species. And on top of that, diarrhea. So, I suppose being a celebrity was not that fun after all. But we could of course somewhat justifiably believe that the treatment was only accidental. It was well-meaning but misguided due to a completely understandable lack of knowledge on the topic. These were the first ever British alpacas after all, and the first ever alpacas that lived outside of South America in general. You can't really expect a newbie in this business to handle the alpacas like an old Inca master herdsman. But at the same time, well, we only get to know what the press reports it on. So essentially, only the tip of the iceberg. Where Cross's alpacas kept in small cages outside of the Piccadilly Circus hours? Did Ducrow use violence to train his alpaca star? Both are very highly likely. This is how they treated their other animals. But were the alpacas somehow treated differently? Well, we just simply do not know. Whatever the case, these were the 1810s. Britain's first years with the alpacas, through every joy and every hardship. And guess what? A decade later, by the 1820s, alpacas were beginning to appear more frequently in the Isles. Most of them seemed to have lived in rather newly set up local zoological associations. Proto-zoos, if you will. Organizations set up for the study and conservation of all kinds of different animals, including, of course, the alpacas. But the alpacas would not just stay indoors to be studied all day. These associations would tour their alpacas around in the form of moving zoos at their local towns and cities every chance they got. And what we know is that the most interesting aspects of the alpaca to these town and city audiences seems to have been their silky wool and a propensity to spit. Yikes. Yeah, we can probably guess what happened there. The audiences went and petted and groped the alpacas to touch the wool, and got spat on for invading the alpaca's personal space. Again, not the best way to treat an alpaca. Alpacas don't just spit around for no reason. So, in conclusion, despite the, well, okay but not optimal ways they were treated, the original purpose of the alpaca in Britain, as we could clearly see, read and hear, seems to have been a curiosity. an adorable and strange show animal that would gather large paying customers around it. Now, the wool was of course also noticed, even by those, I suppose, force-snuggling audiences, but you could not really get out much external material wool-focused profits when there were only a couple dozen alpacas in the entire country. Hey, but no worries, for the benefit of future alpacas and their owners, there was the ever-developing science, which the Britain of the time was, of course, absolutely exceptional at. And at least in theory, if you understand the alpaca, you can both treat them right and profit from them right. As we have clearly figured out, while alpacas were being used as show animals, they also attracted zoological associations together with their scientists. So, there is clearly a kind of entanglement of entertainment and science here, a synthesis, if you will. But if we were to separate them, this research perspective is what I would categorize as the second notable usage for the alpaca in early 1800s Britain. And if we were to pick one alpaca scientist among many, that would 100% be a researcher from the Natural History Society of Liverpool named William Walton. But again, we're not getting that far from entertainment, even with dedicated scientists. Remember Cross? Yeah, our scientist Walton frequented his alpaca showcases in Piccadilly Circus all the time. Guaranteed the two knew each other, probably drank tea and ate biscuits and cakes with the alpacas every Saturday if I were to guess. But Walton was definitely more scientist than entertainer. He had apparently researched alpaca wool as far back as 1807 in the form of samples he had gathered from Buenos Aires wool sacks. Our alpaca scientist, Walton, would also himself travel to Peru as early as 4 years later in 1811. Crazy guy! For context, that was when there was still a war going on in the region. Anyway, while there, he was among the earliest Westerners, and probably amongst the earliest, if not the earliest, proper researcher to see a living alpaca specimen. Needless to say, the man was committed and ambitious, and way ahead of his time. Well, such risky business was certainly not all for nothing, for our brave explorer Walton would end up becoming quite a celebrity with his work. This was after he published his massive and all-encompassing scientific production in the form of several books, the most notable of them being a historical and descriptive account of the 4 species of Peruvian sheep called Carneros de la Tierra in 1811, and a bit later, the alpaca is naturalization in the British Isles considered as a national benefit and as an object of immediate utility to the farmer and manufacturer. Walton's titles really roll off the tongue there. The latter one is also available on Amazon. A really nice niche Christmas present idea for you. Or you can just read it for free online. Link in the description. Anyway, perhaps deservedly so, Walton, together with his works, would end up becoming ultra-famous during the first half of the 19th century. They would be used and sightseed all around the British Empire, and even outside of it, every time alpacas came up in pretty much any context. I mean, even Charles Darwin, the legend himself, read Walton's works and was in an active letter correspondence with the man. They mostly wrote to each other about the guanacos, those being the ancestors of domestic llamas, and pondered if these were practically the same species as the alpaca or not. And if so, well, of course, could they be brought to Britain? Yeah, you heard it right. Dude seemingly wanted to export all of South America's camelids. And well, due to his fame and influence, especially with the... Oh god, the alpaca is naturalization is criticized considered as a national benefit and as an object of immediate utility to the farmer manufacturer, which really hypes up and encouraged the naturalization of the alpacas to Britain. Well, he was definitely among the main players of the early 1800s alpaca hype. So, if you wanted to point fingers at individual people that are the most behind the reasons to why alpacas can now be found all over the world, yeah, go ahead and point them at Walton. There's your guy. And needless to say, considering Walton's impact, the media was also very much interested in the guy. And well, Walton was certainly happy to sit down for a chat. The importance he was given was quite reasonable, because if you actually get into his books, or even read the interviews he gave, this guy really was guaranteed the most knowledgeable alpaca expert in the world. Hands down, no competition. But at the same time, he was not stubborn either, but a critical thinker, a man capable of questioning his results and correcting his mistakes. A true archetype of a scientist. Certainly an impressive man in a lot of ways. Even if you read only a couple interviews this guy gave in the 1810s, despite a couple mistakes here and there, you know, holy frick, this guy really was the god of alpaca trivia if there ever was one. As a little example piece, let's have a look at this here newspaper interview the guy gave in the year 1811. Though it would still be reprinted in countries around the world even a couple decades later, so certainly an influential piece. In this, it is told a reporter met Walton in one of Cross's alpaca showcases. Because that's of course naturally the place where you'd find Walton. Obviously. The reporter would follow Walton to his lab, where he mentions having seen his large taxidermy of an alpaca. The two sit down and Walton opens his mouth. He explains the alpaca's body ratio, the average height of 4 feet, its resemblances and differences with the llama, the quality of the wool, so everything from the flaxiness, lankiness and silkiness of it. And he also explains that alpacas can be found in brown, white, black and a mix of these colors, but that the Andean natives like this black the most, which is why black wool is the most common type used and exported. Interesting. He also says that alpacas are way better behaved than llamas. Quote, "He is the only one of the 4 species that does not express his resentment by spitting his moist cud. This is an indication that his manners are more soft and his disposition more gentle. He has no antic tricks, nor does he bound or leap on his keeper like the llama." End quote. Yeah, alpacas do spit the fair share of moist cud as seen earlier, but it's rarer to see than with llamas, so kinda correct in a way, I suppose. He also explains that alpacas are way more careful with their wool, for they don't roll on the ground. Okay, a quick intervention again. That claim is also very much fake, for alpacas love dust bathing. Helps them groom and protects them from parasites. Yeah, but overall, Walton is quite correct in saying that alpacas are, quote, "in almost every action, more nice and delicate." This apparently also extends to their drinking habits, for as already seemingly realized in Cross's little showcases, alpacas get all of the fluids they need from their food. Apparently when fed green veggies in Britain, they do tend to, however, urinate more. Interesting alpaca pissing habits, but the drinking thing, yeah, I already explained that one earlier. By the way, in his book, where he builds a picture of alpacas as these ultimate survivalists that seemingly never need to drink, only reinforces this misconception. He's of course not completely wrong. Alpacas do get a lot of their water from their food, but no water at all and only food? Yeah, no. Yep. Well, there's something in here that's also somewhat controversial. For Walton criticizes how the Peruvian natives apparently handle their wool production incredibly poorly. Quote, in consequence of the tracts of country on which they pasture being covered with a quantity of furs and thorns, a large portion of their wool is lost, and this, together with their not being carefully folded for the night, makes the Spanish-American wool so extremely dirty. Yeah, the message is quite clear. Get those freaking primitives away from our alpacas and bring those freaking alpacas to Britain. Not an easily justifiable position, but fits the mindsets of the time. Well, later Walton would also get his hands on a microscope. His innovative observations were mostly correct, but again there are a couple faults here as well. Quote, I was enabled to examine the anatomical structure of 3 samples of alpaca wool through a lens magnifying 1 million times. The color of those subjected to the power of the microscope were white, black, and gray. When thrown upon the disc, each filament appeared equal in thickness to a man-of-war's topsail halyard, perfectly distinct, and the fibrous structure more evident than in wool of common sheep. And from my own limited observations, it seems to me that the wool of Peruvian sheep is embedded deeper in the skin than in any other animal of the same class, owing to which, perhaps, the fleece is capable of deriving nourishment more from the inner vessels than usually happens in the Lanigerous tribes. And possibly, the supply is on this account larger. A conclusion warranted, one would think, by the fact that no other animal of the creation affords wool so long, so perfect, and at the same time, so abundant. He is, again, somewhat correct, but also somewhat wrong. Alpacas do have a higher than average density of secondary hair follicles, the structures the good wool grows from, which a blood supply does support. If the blood supply weakens, the wool becomes coarse. This is correct. But this is only the supporting cause. Based on modern research, we know that alpacas don't have a better blood supply per unit of skin area compared to, let's say, sheep, or that the alpaca wool would get a different kind of blood from deeper within the circulatory system than, for example, sheep. Instead, the primary cause for alpaca wool quality are genetics, the structure of the follicles, and the ratio of secondary to primary follicles. But again, Walton himself said that he only did limited observations on this topic, so we can't blame him too hard for getting this wrong. If this was your first time using a microscope, you probably would not get this right either. But we're not done yet. Walton also explains things like how the Andean herdsmen still protect their herds with a sling, and how alpaca wool never goes bad, proven by Incan skeletons. And you know what? This alpaca trivia bombing goes on and on and on. I only scratched the surface. Well, you can buy that book from Amazon for more, but for the context of this video, we can clearly induce that the alpaca, together with its wool, were though and very much scientifically proven as something quite special and as something quite needed in Britain. But, needless to say, Walton was not correct 100% of the time. And when he is pretty much the pioneer and father of alpaca science in general, and during the early days, pretty much the only source of info on the topic, and when there are undeniably a number of faults in his conclusions, yep, it's not probably too surprising to hear that Britain's first alpaca herders did end up with some practical issues on the ground. But again, humans are not epistemologically perfect in any way whatsoever. Everyone makes mistakes. Give the guy some slack. Even Walton's pen pal Darwin did not get everything right. Most notably when it comes to genetics and the cell level. Same type of mistakes as with Walton. Stuff isn't easy, you know. But still, Darwin and Walton did do their best, and we should appreciate them for that. Yup, but alpaca science does not stop at Darwin and Walton, for there was more. Besides all these previous aspects, covered from environment to physiology to behavior to economic potential, other zoologists of the time were also debating the taxonomy of the alpaca. At first, they were thought of as a sheep, but some thought they could also be categorized as goats. But at the same time, they seem to also look like camelids, as proposed by people like Walton. Which is, of course, what the eventual final taxonomic conclusion was. Alpacas are camelids. Walton was right. Well, despite this, the same debate also existed and continued among lay people, but in a more informal, casual way. First of all, well, honestly, thanks to Walton himself calling them Peruvian sheep, the commoners did not often even call these animals alpacas, but indeed, Peruvian sheep. Or alternatively, Peruvian goat. Or by mixing them both, the Peruvian sheep-goat. Or when they messed up even in the geography department, the I kid you not, Mexican sheep-goat. Later on, these strange namings were however understood as false, and the original name given to it by its Andean native breeders, Alpaca, stuck. Most people did not quite manage to connect the term to the actual animal, though. They knew of alpaca as a type of wool, but only the rare had any idea it came from anything other than a sheep. Yeah, I know. People's ignorance is funny and all, yet, honestly, quite understandable. This was a new topic, there was not much info available on it, besides, like, Walton, God bless, and, well, let's be honest, this is definitely a type of obscure trivia topic. Certainly not common knowledge, or something they teach you at school. But luckily, the reporters of the time were there to attempt to fulfill this hole in public knowledge. They used a mixture of already known animals to try to describe the alpaca, to really explain its base essence to the lay people. Here's a great example from Australia, funnily enough. Britain's colony. What? The alpaca, which is proposed to domesticate in Britain, is an animal combining the appearance of the common European sheep with that of the goat, and partly of the deer and camel. Like the sheep, the alpaca is languorous or wool-coated. In its general structure, it is light, and possesses limbs adapted for springing and leaping like the goat. And though without the camel's deformities, it is gifted like him with patience and docility, being often treated as a beast of burden by the natives of South America. The height of the alpaca is from 3 to 4 feet when measured from the ground to the top of the back. The eyes are large, black, soft and expressive. The animal has no horns, the neck is long, slender, curved backwards and finely set. The head handsome and the muzzles and ears lengthened. The hoof is horny and divided. The tail long and resembling what is called a switch tail. The body has a taping towards the loins, resembling the grey hound. And as you regard the other points, the alpaca has partly the characteristics of the sheep, its incisors on the lower jaw, for example, and 6 molar teeth on each side. And partly those of the camel, the most remarkable being a similar reservoir in the stomachs for fluids, suiting the creature to an arid climate. To common observers, the alpaca might seem to be a fine tall goat with a small head and no horns, but of more gentle and fleecy appearance than that animal. End quote. Well, besides goats and sheep, often the alpacas were also mixed up with llamas, which are of course a different species, but nevertheless a close relative within the same llamelid family. People still mix up their llamas and alpacas, so it's not that surprising that the confusion also existed 200 years ago. This all is of course technically true according to their taxonomy, but sometimes when an alpaca and a llama really like each other, they break away from their tightly set taxonomy and interbreed. The result is a kind of mule, what is called a huarizo. One of these Alpacas was seen in the harbour of Liverpool in 1842. It was called a rare specimen and a curiosity. It also seems to have had a really strange kind of wool, which also raised confusion. Always with the freaking wool. So, seemingly even with the mixed breeds, wool was still something that people of the time kept noticing and thinking about. But perhaps rightfully so, as eventually as the alpacas increased in number and the technology to actually use the wool developed further, this business would become the real deal across the wool industries of the entire world! Right, boys, this is the reason why you should not live in an apartment building. Because they don't really like me screaming about alpacas. Well, like and subscribe and follow and ring the bells and whatever else for more Mexican sheep-goat content. I'll be covering the birth of the alpaca wool industry and what Queen Victoria has to do with it next time. Thank you and bye-bye!